Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Okay, so today, of course, we are continuing on with our read of Counter Revolution of 1776 by Gearld Horne. And we are on chapter 7, page 161 on PDF. The Biggest Losers, Africans and the 7 Years' War. As I say, we probably won't do this whole chapter today, but I at least want to do some of it today. The beginning of what has been called the 7 Years' War in 1756, also denoted as the French and Indian War, between London and mainland settlers on the one hand, with some indigenous and Africans, and the usual antagonists, European foes, the indigenous and Africans on the other hand, was a continuation of what had become a decades-long conflict. For our purposes here, what is critically important is the impact of this conflict on the tangled issues of slavery and the slave trade, and the growth of secessionist sentiment. In short, this war led to Madrid being ousted from Florida, and for a brief period Cuba, as Paris was evicted from Quebec. But once more, this proved to be a catastrophic victory for London. For when pressure was eased on the mainland settlers as a result, they seized the opportunity to revolt against the crown with ample aid from the Catholic powers. Ultimately, this led to creation of a slaveholders' republic that then ousted the European powers from leadership in the African slave trade and gobbled their mainland provinces in the process, meaning Africans were the biggest losers, along with their indigenous comrades. Though it had been thought that Spain, a noticeable nemesis of London, had been defeated decisively in the 1740s and 1750, Carolinians were negotiating futilely with St. Augustine on a pact guaranteeing the mutual return of escaped Africans, or capital flight. But since the flow of Africans was generally one way, headed southward, there was little incentive for Madrid to negotiate in good faith. Even though, supposedly, there had been a cessation of hostilities between London and Madrid, as of 1748, in the wake of their latest combativeness, 1752, saw Spanish privateers seizing a sloop sailing from Antigua, perhaps the most problematic of colonies, to New York, and taken to Puerto Rico. Restitution was demanded by the powerful governor of Virginia, though odds were that this demand would be rebuffed. As ever, the external threat made the internal one appear even more fearsome. In mid-1755, Governor Robert Dinwiddie was irate about the villainy of the Negroes, quote unquote, when the province faced any emergency. This was always feared, which was no exaggeration. Near that same time, Spaniards were brazenly committing acts of piracy against ships sailing to Jamaica, from Jamaica to Virginia, seizing rum, coffee, wine, silks, sugar, and slaves. Similarly frightening for mainlanders was that the Spanish crew, in this instance, included an Irishman, giving sustenance to the suspicion that the slave conspiracy a few years earlier in Carolina may have involved Madrid. Subsequently, Virginia's governor was informed that the colony's militia does not amount to 7,000 men and was thinly spread over a widely extended country. If there was a foreign invasion, the province contained 50,000 Negro slaves, to whom, no doubt, an invader would proclaim liberty upon their joining them. Governor Dinwiddie was forced to admit that what had bamboozled mainland colonies in the 17th century was persisting in the 18th also: the combined danger of Negro insurrection and foreign invasion. The only change was that the flood of arriving Africans in the wake of the slave trade reforms simply made the danger more palpable. In the immediate prelude to 1756, suggestive of how on the edge the settlers were, Virginians were debating whether they should arm some of the most trusty of their slaves, and were considering how to keep and increase the aversion which happily subsists between Negroes and Indians. Stoking enmity between the latter two was a strategic initiative by colonists. By 1756, the cry arose from Hanover, Virginia, that, quote, there are so many black foreigners amongst ourselves as may justly alarm our fears, and in Carolina they are much more numerous than the county militia. Now, if the French should invade our frontiers, and if the Indians that are now neuter should join with them, and if these united forces should pour down upon us and meet with the welcome reception and assistance from so powerful an enemy among ourselves, then scenes of blood, cruelty, and devastation would open in our country. For the doubters, it was added ominously, it is not so improbable as we could wish. These black foreigners, quote unquote, could very well be followers or sympathizers of His Catholic Majesty, if recent history were a guide, thus compounding the perils discerned. Yet symptomatic of the stiff challenges faced by the mainland settlers was the fact that by 1760, even Georgia, where allergies to abolition and Africans seemed interchangeable, there was spirited discussion concerning, quote, Negroes that may be trusted with arms in the militia. The colony had opened the floodgates, and Africans had flowed in accordingly. The overall population tripled between 1760 and 1773, while the population of slaves almost quintupled. And, as had been predicted since 1733, the security of the province plummeted accordingly. A situation hardly assuaged by considering the arming of Africans. Mainland colonies had become the land of limited alternatives. Repetitive wars with indigenes and Europeans alike, and the constant bleeding of slave resistance had taken an appalling toll on settlers, which was exacerbated by the callous brutality of military discipline, which fueled desertions and mutinies, and the occasional strike. Arming Africans to guard a system based on enslavement of Africans was both a non sequitur and an emblematic of a system being ripped apart by multiplying contradictions. Something had to be done, particularly since competitors were placing more, not less, pressure on mainland settlements with every passing day, just as Spain placed pressure on British settlers to arm Africans when it pursued this policy. France's policy of providing ever more lavish presents to the indigenous provided a similar motivation for Britain. Thus, once more, London was forced into the breach, shedding blood and treasure in copious amounts for 7 long years, not least because settlers' disastrous policies towards Africans created enormous opportunities for Madrid and Paris to exploit handsomely. What resulted was a disastrous victory. For pushing the Spanish out of Florida and the French out of Quebec by 1763 eased pressure on mainland settlers and infuriated Paris and Madrid, which now had incentive to bolster a rebellion against British rule. That London felt it necessary to tax the settlers. In a real sense, this war was for their benefit, combined with the already yawning economic chasm between colony and metropolis to create conditions for the rise of a new republic. Certainly, taxing of imports of slaves, which was also of military significance, further eroded London's support, both on the mainland and within important centers such as Bristol as well. A little familiar, isn't it? In other words, in the 1756 war was both a solution and a problem. Yes, ousting Spain and France from their North American strongholds was a plus for London, but it arrived with a profound cost. Settlers, too, were running a grave risk whenever the specter of all-out war was brooded. The eminent Carolinian Charles Pinckney, like others, felt that the 1756 war would mean that the Africans would take advantage of the flux and, as had been their habit, quote, rise upon their masters and cut their throats in hopes of obtaining freedom. This thought may have occurred to Samuel Davies of Virginia, who in 1756 was reduced to beseeching his Africans to remain loyal to him in the face of a possible French invasion, as if the same did not apply to his class. He denounced the potential invaders as cruel, barbarous people who punished Africans with death in the most shocking manner, quote unquote. Colonial Philadelphia, in many ways, the leading mainland city, was typical in that 1756 marked the onset of a decade in which slavery reached a zenith. As the assorted, accumulated factors of the rise of private traders, the retreat from the Caribbean to the mainland, and the generating economic engine of these colonies, now seemingly running on all cylinders, all began to assert themselves forcefully. Feeding this phenomenon was the drying up of the supply of indentured German and Scottish-Irish laborers, a process driven in part by events in Europe, and by London's vigorous recruiting for its war machine. Thus, 1762 was the peak year of importation of Africans in Philadelphia's history. To that point, and it also happened to be the year when, in a remarkable development, London ousted Madrid from the key colony that was Cuba, a major fruit of the war. Yet, while the mainland was heading towards a rosy dawn of renewed enslavement, London was inching towards abolition, even among Quakers, virtually isolated in Philadelphia as vigorous opponents of enslavement. Manumissions were rare until the eve of 1776. Many settlers, even those with abolitionist stirrings, had yet to grasp the unavoidable tie between exploitation of the enslaved and expropriation of native lands, and how one fed the other. Yet in Britain, William Hogarth, whose fame as a painter had yet to evaporate when he passed away in 1764, in his illuminating art had associated the servitude of Africans with moral corruption, while portraying the darker skinned as independent personalities. It was this view that was rising in London, as an opposing viewpoint was ascending in mainland provinces. As the population of Africans increased in Pennsylvania, so grew the diversity of their origins in a manner that emitted troubling signals. By 1762, there were advertisements calling for a return of fleeing Africans with roots in Guadeloupe and facility in municiplicity of languages, not to mention Spanish Negroes, whose record of stirring unrest was well known. The number of Africans in the colony of New York doubled between 1723 and 1756, and, with the French and Spanish threats then dissipated, ultimately tripled during the 6 decades between 1731 and 1790. And that nobody can undo them. Nobody can solve them, Dave, right? Well, other than those revolting. And I don't mean the settlers. The African population in New York City increased by over 20% every year between 1756 and 1771. It was during the heat of war that New York merchants began to increase investments in the African slave trade, as if they anticipated the ultimate result in 1763. Shipboard insurrections, too, received more prominence as a result, which may have had an impact on exhilarating antipathy towards Africans, thereby paradoxically hastening the trade's exhilaration. Yet, shipboard insurrections were precisely the violently distasteful acts that fueled the abolitionist sentiments of London, who held dear Hogarth's images of Africans. By 1761, West Africans on board a vessel departing the Gold Coast launched a bloody revolt, with 20 of their number murdered as a result. But increasingly, such bloodshed was seen on the west bank of the Atlantic as a mere cost of doing important business. Despite the clear difficulty in delivering Africans to Manhattan, by 1756, there were almost 20,000 slaves who lived within a 50-mile radius of New York City. At that moment, slaves constituted about 25% of the total population of what is now New York City, and the present-day suburbs of Westchester and Suffolk counties, as well as Bergen County, New Jersey. Male slaves were about 60% of the total enslaved population in these agricultural regions, which was not a prescription for stability. Nonetheless, there was a gift to slavery on the mainland delivered by London's vigorous prosecution of the 1756 war. This was accompanied by an incompatibility of growing abolitionism within the British Isles and growing enslavement in its provinces. Naturally, the emblematic province that was South Carolina did not elude this trend. That is, the irrepressibly turbulent scare about the African present following the Stoner Revolt had dissipated by the mid-1750s, when imports of Africans began to creep up steadily again. As the number of Africans grew, along with crazed agitation about their ultimate intentions, political discord was muted among the settler elite, as merchants who owned plantations cooperated with planters who were dependent on the export trade, a tendency that rose with the war. The mirror image of their concord was the extraordinary number of plots by the enslaved leading up to and continuing during the 1756 war. As the 1756 war was winding down, one key low country district was all too typical of the surroundings. Of the adult males there between the ages of 16 and 70, there were 1,064 Africans, but only 76% of persons defined as white. But only 76 persons defined as white. Think about that ratio. The 1,064 Africans, but only 76 persons defined as white. Yet, when hundreds of Acadian refugees poured into Carolina, Governor James Glenn was among those who expressed utmost unease, since it was felt that they may watch opportunities and join with the Negroes. Among the opportunities was the fear that Negro chimney sweeps were thought to be preparing the ground for mass immolation of slaveholding elite and their allies. Still, why not embrace fellow whites, particularly given the numerous Africans all around? There was still kind of religious war at play, and whiteness was hardly a hard fact, but akin to a fervent projection. In other words, when the provinces demanded more white settlers, they hardly had patriotic French Catholics in mind. What they had in mind was what was to evolve: Europeans willing to tolerate African enslavement and unwilling to conspire with foreign antagonists against their slave society. Hence, since France was at war with Britain, it was felt that this would override all else, particularly since these Catholics were an early victim of ethnic cleansing. In 1756, a prominent slave dealer observed that religious liberty extended to all, meaning, for example, the High Church, Low Church, Quakers, New Lights, Old Lights, Anabaptists, LL, all save the Roman Catholic, who is utterly denied the public use of his profession in almost all parts of America. The unease at the arrival of the Acadians could have created more suspicion of London. How dare the crown dump potential subversives and religious oddballs in their province? Which suggested the dilemma faced by the crown, in that even seeking to bolster the white population might lead to exacerbating attitudes among the mainlanders. The question was not trusting whites, but trusting the French. Consider that during the war, it was suspected widely, redolent of decades of history, that London's foes were enticing Africans in the colonies with promises of freedom in return for aid. In the pivotal New York, New Jersey region, a 1756 report expressed anxiety about too great intimacy between Negro slaves and the French neutrals in this province, which may at this time tend to stir up the Negroes to an insurrection when such numbers of this province's militia are detached to the front line and to the frontiers against the French. Unquote. This was not a trivial matter, since during this war, enslaved African men were enlisted in the New York militia through various means and accompanied redcoats to distant frontiers where Frenchmen were prevalent. A metropolis edging closer to abolition and colonies moving in the opposite direction. A paradigmatic colony frowning on the arrival of what today would be a considered racial brethren to countervail a disproportionate number of Africans. Such factors were creating an untenable relationship that collapsed by 1776. As ever, the infighting between the private traders and the now withering RAC seemed to overshadow the overarching conflict with the European powers. Looking back from 1744, one Londoner saw nothing but negative and little but the advance of European competitors from the time the RAC monopoly eroded in the late 1690s up to that present moment. Private traders may have benefited from this erosion, but as one analyst argued in 1748, it was necessary to keep up the awe and respect of the barbarous natives by the power that can be punish or protect them. And private traders were not sufficiently cohesive to do this. Compared to an entity akin to the once formidable RAC, this argument did not prevail, and, according to some observers, served to pave the way for the rise in this important commerce of London competitors, which could only mean harming London's interests in the colonies and making warfare in 1756 inexorable. Thus, from Barbados, in some ways a more valuable colony than Jamaica, came the 1752 report that there had been no Negroes supplied by the Royal African Company for many years. They were all furnished by separate traders. Thus, although it appeared that Britain and its colonial appendages were acquitting themselves well in the race to enchain Africans, a growing chorus of voices in London and the Americas disagreed, asserting that actually the race was being lost to European competitors. A tendency was rising that came to define the emerging republic. As retrograde forces grew in strength, they complained and whined paradoxically about their weakness, as if they realized deep in their hearts that the reactionary nature of their conquests would inexorably generate a fierce and deliberating response. Thus, these flesh peddlers felt that their opponents were grabbing their hardy Africans, leaving to London. It was emphasized that tender, effeminate Negroes, who were absolutely unfit for the land labor of the sugar colonies, unquote, meaning these slaves must always be a loss and disappointment to the planters. For the planters, this also meant, quote, one great cause of their being now deeply in debt, and must be their ruin. London was losing, it was thought, in the race to enslave Gold Coast and Wadya Negroes, places where the French were powerful competitors of the British, and by the various encouragements given in Paris, are enabled to pay a higher price than British private traders. These latter West Africans, it was reported, were the most valuable and so necessary for the subsistence of sugar plantations, as they were hardy and are inured to labor, which was not the case with Negroes from Angola and Calabar. And those from Gambia, leftovers, then were consigned to London settlements. If London was actually losing to Paris in a battle for such a valuable resource of Africans, perceived as the most worthy of the enslaved, this could mean further momentum for war to reverse the gathering debacle, which would also mean taxes on settlers to pay for the war, since Africans were the essential coin of their realm. For as one propagandist argued, the settlements were an inexhaustible fund of wealth and naval power to this nation, while the erosion of the RAC's monopoly had served simply to erode British power and empower European rivals. But this propagandist, like others, seemed befuddled by the rise of private traders and merchants and the newly enchanted age of capitalism they represented. The controversy about increased taxes also affected that most valuable of commodities, Africans, with some Virginia interests objecting in stern terms in the pivotal year that was 1756 about the prospect of such a policy, which was nothing new. By 1760, objections to such imposts had hardly budged. Though the preamble of proposed legislation in the Dominion noted that due to the insults and encroachments of the French, there was a need to raise £20,000, so an additional duty of 10% was imposed upon all slaves imported or brought into this colony and Dominion for sale. But this was a great disadvantage to the settlement and improvement of the lands in the colony, as it prevents the importation of slaves and thereby lessens the fund arising from the duties upon slaves. So this law was hereby repealed. This meant the arrival of more Africans in the middle of the war. Though this troublesome property had a demonstrated propensity to take advantage of the encroachments of the French and Spanish. Importing more Africans and throwing caution to the wind was part of the culture of mainland colonists. After all, though an objective naysayer would argue that bringing more Africans was folly, the settlements were still standing and, by some measures, thriving, which is hardly a reason to change course or culture. What upset many settlers was taxes on imported Africans, not the presence of this valued commodity. Associating the lifeblood of government, taxes, with fearsome Africans was destined to complicate further administration on the mainland. Thus, the danger notwithstanding, by 1747, Governor Gooch of Virginia was gloating about the 2,000 Africans imported the last summer from the coast of Africa. Yet, simultaneously, he was moaning about the misfortune of having the capital of this city, speaking of Williamsburg, burnt down, whether by accident or design, has not yet been discovered, though from the circumstances there is reason to suspect the latter. The estimable Gooch had difficulty in connecting the influx of Africans to the rise of instability. Old Governor Gooch. You know Governor Gooch. White that is a white goddamn name right there, Old Gooch. Going to Old Gooch's house, racist old turd. In the midst of the 1756 war, potential migrants in Britain were apprised of the attractions of South Carolina. They were told of a tax that was so heavy on imported Africans that it amounted to a prohibition, and thus was forced out of its existence. But now the war, too, had prevented any from being imported, at least officially. I do not find that in above 9 years' time, it was announced in 1761, our number of Negroes is diminished, but on the contrary increased. This growth had reached the point where the Negroes bred from our own stock will continually recruit and keep it up, if not enable us to supply the sugar colonies with a small number of Negroes, which could thwart presumed French control of the most bountiful slave territories. Left unsaid was what means, particularly crude means, were used to engender procreation. Also left unsaid was whether the growth of shipboard insurrections had created an incentive for settlers to breed their own stock. Yet, when the Esquire turned to raise revenue to pay for this war, it would be hard pressed to avoid taxing the growing number of Africans, irrespective of how they arrived in Carolina. Thus, it was reported in 1724 there were 14,000 white people in the colony and about 32,000 slaves, mostly Negroes, while as of that writing, the former had grown to 25,000 and the number of Negroes amounted to 39,000, though the latter figure was more precise, because a tax is paid for them. As some Londoners saw things, Madrid was seeking to reverse the logic of history by seizing Georgia and Carolina. But the strategic problem hardly addressed frontally was whether bringing more Africans to Charleston and Savannah could more readily effectuate Spain's dream. As late as 1762, Benjamin Martin, a leading colonist, was ranting that the frontier to the southern province of North America was exposed to danger by the Spaniards, who laid claim to all the lands from St. Augustine as far as Charlestown. The southern provinces of North America are now become objects of the highest consequence of the French also, from their lair in nearby Mobile. Paris and Madrid were also, it was thought, denying Bristol and Liverpool merchants their due in the slave trade. As one self-described proprietor put it, this security threat was aided immeasurably by the French, our most dangerous trading rivals. Parisians were challenging these settlers on all fronts, particularly in the realm of control of human capital, since whatever deprives the American planters of slaves, or enhances the price of them, he said, is essential detrimental to the colonies. But even this candid assessment ignores what others well knew. Mainland settlers were busily engaged in mutually profitable business deals with London's most dangerous rivals. as Britain was engaged in what was thought to be a battle for supremacy, if not survival, in a death match with these rivals. Quite the naughty contradiction, no? Want to see something here. Okay, we'll go to the next break. We'll go to the next break and then we'll read the other half of this chapter, or the last 10 pages of this chapter next time. War had recurred yet again. But once more, in order to gain a fuller picture of its manifestation on the mainland, more background on events in the Caribbean in the period leading up to 1756 is necessary. For the 1756 war was about the future not only of the mainland, but also of the Caribbean.
He's a communist.
Oh, really?
Yep, big communist, big communist.
Oh.
French strength in Hispaniola and Spanish strength in Cuba were more than a match for London's Jamaican bastion. Underlying all of these empires of slavery was the African slave trade, the fruits of which had helped to drive conflict between the European powers in the 1740s. Rather than being a departure, 1756 was a continuation. As an aside, doesn't this sound eerily similar to Yang's ideas on tax on robotic production? Right? In like a weird, yeah. God, Yang is cringe in so many ways. And even the thing about universal basic income, we should be very weary of it because we should be worried that it's going to be used to undermine and push further austerity measures on us, right? Like, sure, we'll give you money, but now you got to pay for your healthcare and your fucking and everything else. That universal basic income shit is not good. It sounds good, but it's not good. Trust me. Not if it's from capitalists. You can be rest assured. If they really wanted to provide for people instead of giving them a universal basic income, they would, provide all their needs. Yeah, look, Dave, we'd love to abolish slavery, but the markets just won't have it. And that's literally what was happening. And what's funny, right, is like happening to the degree that they were bringing in the gravediggers, the things that were threatening their exact colonial system, and they still couldn't help but bringing them in at an ever accelerated pace. Wild. And that shows you how short-sighted capitalism is, right? In many ways. That is, as London's settlers felt compelled to retreat from the Caribbean to the mainland in the face of maroons and various liquidation plots engineered by Africans. This was only increasing the Crown's headaches. In 1754, some voices in London were still begging for more white people to settle in Jamaica, so as to be able to defend that great island. But any who scanned headlines regularly would view such a proposal with extreme skepticism. In the middle of the conflict with Maroons, a similar call was made in order to form a barrier against the rebellious Negroes for the security of the old planters, and fell on deaf ears. Cinnamon. It was truly remarkable, it was conceded, that the lands appropriated for these would-be settlers in Jamaica was in the neighborhood of the rebel Negroes, as if proponents were actually seeking to discourage settlements. Besides, the remaining planters in Jamaica wanted to send their sugar and produce directly to foreign markets, without being obliged to bring them first to Great Britain, which was opposed by the manufacturers, as these planters too sought to have their profiteering Trump allegiance to the crown and its closest allies in London. Even during the late war, London found smugglers from Jamaica were dealing with Spanish dominions, a la mainlanders. Indeed, it was charged war with Spain was profitable to the island of Jamaica. At least, as all war with Spain is, though ruinous for Great Britain. But despite the contribution to the Esquire, Jamaica was not the mainland. It could not as easily flout prerogatives of the crown, not least because mobilized Maroons limited planters' options. Perhaps London or even colonists would draw the obvious inference that mobilized Africans on the mainland could limit interdependency options similarly. Of course, it was improbable that Jamaica or the other sugar colonies would be abandoned altogether, particularly since these territories allowed for more forthright and proximate challenge to Cuba and Hispaniola. Moreover, there was a kind of integration between and among London's colonies, with events in the Caribbean reverberating on the mainland. David Cutter Braddock is an example. He spent a good deal of time in Savannah, where he was a major landholder, but also was in and out of Jamaica, the Turks Island, New England, and Charleston on a regular basis. The ampler point was that African rebelliousness was serving to drive settlers from the Caribbean to the mainland, which increased the importance of the latter, helping to contribute to the 1756 war. In Jamaica, Braddock may have heard that planters were complaining about the cost of Africans, which was rising. And even if there was a concern in London about adding to the ungovernable supply of this island, perhaps greater concern remained about the impact of their presence in terms of the conflict with Madrid and Paris, and their allying with these powers. Pressure from these powers had hampered trade with the mainland. For example, the supply of horses from North America, especially from Rhode Island. Horses were now twice the price as before. And, unless the price of sugar rises, the planter can't go on. He must be ruined. But there were two particular matters that had concentrated this former Jamaican planter's mind more than others: the price of slaves and the burden of taxes, which were linked. For if the latter increased, the planters would be disabled from purchasing every year a fresh supply of Negroes. Unquote. Slaves were bought chiefly with the produce of manufacturers, including firearms, gunpowder, spirits, tallow, some India goods, woolen goods. But paying more taxes meant buying fewer Africans, which meant producing fewer manufacturing goods. Yet, if Africans were still being snatched and could not be disposed of in London's various settlements, then the surplus would be sent to the Spanish coast for gold and silver, allowing more Africans to populate Spanish settlements, which seemed contrary to London's long-term interests. Yup. Hey, lady, welcome. Hope you're doing well. I fell asleep watching your stream. Welcome in, comrade. Salute. Worsening London. We're reading Counter-Revolution of 1776 by Gearld Horne, which is about why the so-called American Revolution was actually a counter-revolution. Was actually the opposite of what we constantly hear in the mainstream media, which is in the mainstream history books, which is that, the American Revolution was a progress to humanity. This book argues just the opposite. So get comfy. We're reading in here. Worsening London's strategic dilemma was that some Jamaican Africans were fleeing to Cuba, as their counterparts in Carolina were fleeing to Florida. The consequences to this island will be very fatal, opined one subject in 1751. Opined! Word of the week. By 1760, yet another significant slave rebellion rocked Jamaica. The only surprise being that the planters were caught unawares, with agitated undulations from this revolt flowing like molten lava in the coming years. While still confronting boiling unrest in Jamaica in the middle of a war, London then had to deal with what was described as an unintended insurrection of the Negroes in Bermuda, which was repressed barely. Horne is awesome. This had been preceded by acute food shortages caused by a spate of French privateering, which was thought to have motivated the Africans there, suggesting their objective alliance with London's enemies. Jay is a huge opiner. Huge opiner over there. If you want to see some opining live, you follow our comrade Jay at Barfcast TV. Welcome in, Jay. I see you over there. Salute. Paris had its problems too. For in the late 1750s, a major slave conspiracy erupted in Hispaniola. As had been the pattern, Africans chose the time of war between the major powers to assert and leverage their own power and influence, which put them in a better military position. The problem for London was that concessions to Africans to foil such conspiracies would not be accepted happily on the mainland and could serve to accelerate the incipient push to independence. Of course, disposing of these Africans on the mainland was one way out, which is what occurred in Manhattan, Philadelphia, and various other North American sites. But such transfers were not an ideal remedy, giving Africans demonstrative restiveness. Moreover, since planters and governors worried about the pulsating unrest in one colony was a boon to another, African subversion probably increased factionlessness between and among the provinces, to the detriment of London's overall colonial project. Interesting, matron. It remains true that in the 1760s in Massachusetts, the argument arose more forcefully that security meant getting rid of slavery, and perhaps Africans too. A conclusion that was driven largely by reaction to events beyond its shores. For example, Manhattan 1741 and Jamaica 1760. It was evident by then that there was an irreconcilable clash between how British settlers chose to maltreat Africans and the reaction of this besieged group, which was thereby incentivized to ally with European rivals and the indigenous alike, to the detriment of these same settlers. As the 1756 war was concluding, there were more sales of Africans from Massachusetts to far-flung sites. A kind of ersatz abolitionism that was to become au courant in the Republic. Ultimately, there was a conflation on the mainland of getting rid of both slaves and Africans generally, since the latter, in whatever guise, were perceived as a threat to internal security. Sound familiar? In the immediate aftermath of the war, legislation was introduced in Boston to bar the importation of enslaved Africans, while another was designed to tax imports. Similarly, in Delaware, measures were introduced to bar importing of slaves in the aftermath of war, alongside more draconian regulation of those who remained, including proscribing profane swearing. Still, the market for Africans was so deep and liquid that it was unclear if Boston or Newcastle or Williamton could ever be a real mover of the market. On the other hand, a scant century later, forces from Massachusetts were battling voraciously their erstwhile mainland compatriots in Dixie, and the issue of the future of African bondage hung in the balance, as the complicated saga of capitalism propelled by slavery entered its terminal phase. Again, ready alternatives were not perceived by settlers as being readily available in the mid 18th century. During the summer of 1757, a mainland slave trader was moaning about the, quote, great decry of trade in these parts, speaking of coastal West Africa, occasioned by the French War and scarcity of English shipping, which had affected dramatically the price of Comrade Mama M Media, thank you so much for the raid, comrade. Get in, get comfortable. We're just finishing this section of the chapter on Gearld Horne's counter-revolution of 1776. We're rapidly approaching the date of 1776. We're talking right now about revolts on the Caribbean that are having reverberations on the mainland and causing the settlers to deepen this contradiction that they cannot get out of. Meanwhile, of course, their enemies, the Spanish and the French, are more and more arming Africans and militias in order to fight wars, and this is causing a sort of another contradiction. Not staying. If it's not Twitch fucking me over, it's OBS. I'm going to lay down. Oh, Mama, I'm sorry to hear that, comrade. I hope you get some rest and feel better when you get back up. Fuck you, Twitch, and fuck you, OBS, for fucking around with Mama. Just saying. The Africans purchased were as difficult as ever, he thought, straining to retain their ancient customs without alteration, while treating attempts to impose Christianity upon them, thought to be a condition precedent to assimilating them successfully to enslavement, with ridicule or laughter, despite his most strenuous efforts. Repeatedly, France was denounced during this war for having its vessels lying in wait for the slave traders, who sped from Newport with cargoes of rum destined for Africa, and thence to the Caribbean with Africans in chains. With the African trade hampered, obtaining Africans in the Caribbean, despite their manifest tendency to create disturbances, at times seemed like the least horrible option. Massachusetts was simply not a market maker in this regard. But as long as Madrid and Paris, as was their wont, were determined to collaborate with Africans against mainlanders, the neat solution of reliance on the Caribbean market remained problematic at best. Bringing Africans from Antigua to the mainland, which was occurring in the prelude to 1756, also brought an uncertain benefit to those who were poised to rebel against London. While it reminded the metropolis that perhaps a different policy towards Africans and enslavement might be warranted. Wiping out Spanish settlements in Florida and even Cuba, and ousting the French from Quebec would slice the Gordian knot, it was thought. Nonetheless, there was a recognition in London that the Caribbean and settlements generally were hardly stable, and were replete with unforeseen circumstances. Thus it was said in 1753, Cromwell's war with Spain, though it procured to us Jamaica, weakened our other islands by the numbers drawn out of them for the St. Domingo expedition. With the ouster of French from Quebec and Spain from Florida lead to a similar result? More than this, what was acknowledged then has been little recognized since. That is, the Negroes are ever true to their own interests, without being at all slow in apprehending them. Unquote. And they were hardly wedded to London, as Antigua, 1736, and Carolina, 1739, well showed, but in a pinch would align with Paris, Madrid, the indigenous, or all of the foregoing. But London, too, was encased in a trap of its own making. More slaves to the colonies meant more opportunity for European competitors to weaken and overthrow British rule. Taxing African imports so as to restrain their presence and raise revenue to better confront competitors meant alienating mainland planters, or Bristol, or both. Thus, at the midpoint of the 18th century, London's prospects in the Americas were not as bright as they seemed. Relocation from the Caribbean to the mainland and driving more Africans to the latter can be seen in retrospect as analogously disastrous as Napoleon's invasion of and then retreat from Russia. The 1756 war, however it turned out, was unlikely to reverse this dim picture, as even a victory simply delivered a further disaster. What do I get left? 9 pages? No. Yeah. 6? 8? There's 82. It's 423. Fuck it. We're still going. We're still going. We're almost at the end. Such a good writer, just the right amount of fluffy language. And I love the way he integrates the quotes of what people were saying then. The reason why I don't say quote all the time when we're reading this one is just because I would be saying quote far too many times. Because he sort of integrates the quotes of the way people were talking back then with what he's saying. So I kind of just have to read it as is and put in the quotes when we get the longer sections. But the good thing about that is, like, it shows you that he's, like, sort of objectively thinking of these things, right? Like, he's showing you how well, yeah, the sources. He's showing you the sources right here in the work themselves. Instead of you going down to the footnotes and finding all of the quotes there. The quotes are right here, and the footnotes tell you who did the quote and when. Incredible. And that I love that way that he writes. Yeah, I still got at least an hour, so let's keep going. Fuck it. Exactly, Dave. It's needed. This is rare good academia in capitalist society. Yeah. Yeah. Again, listen to colonized people. They're doing the work. They're doing some damn good work out here, you know? Massachusetts, which was a cradle for revolt against the crown, symbolized this problem. For it had formidable problems in confronting its population of Africans, while keeping a wary eye on Quebec, a problem that accelerated in the prelude to the 1756 war.
I would have been friends with Stalin.
Actually, this was just the flip side of solving the knotty matter of having within one's borders numerous European settlers who were determined to get on with the nasty business of ousting the indigenous and making fortunes, and thus were not as inclined to participate in ambitious ventures that might take one to Cartagena or Santiago de Cuba. Before the war, these male settlers were hastening the authorities with various and creative means of avoiding conscription. to the point where elites were thinking the unthinkable and emphasizing the great number of Negro men there who may be made very useful in case of an invasion. Now obliging the said Negroes to take up arms when being pursued. Exactly, absolutely, and that's why he's one of Torrance one of the few historians we read as if we're reading theory. Next, we're gonna do State and Revolution though after this book. But the Africans might have been less enthusiastic than those who were seeking to command them. For by 1747, there were riotous proceedings involving armed seamen, servants, Negroes, and others in the town of Boston, tending to the destruction of all government and order. Following Impressionists. By 1748, both problems merged when Africans were jailed for arson and European settlers were still proving to be troublesome soldiers. That's weird, Mama. What the fuck? Settlers were absconding and deserting. And those who remained, said Governor William Shirley, were engaged in riot and insult upon the king's government. This extraordinary revolt by a mob was occasioned by conscription. The revolt against the draft was slated to be crushed by force, and the need to fire upon him. Unimpressed, the accused rioters threatened to burn a 20-gun ship being built for His Majesty. This outrageous tumult, this inexcusable insurrection, was worrisome, particularly since the militia charged with the crushing of it was very tardy in responding. Perhaps worse, the reason for this unrest was disturbing, since the uneasiness was propelled by the difference made between the Sugar Colony Islands and His Majesty's colonies upon the northern continent. Insofar as London was exempting the former from the kind of conscription visited upon the mainlanders. Evidently, the rioters did not accept the idea that the sugar colonies had a deficit of whites, and could not spare them because of the surplus of mutinous Africans, which meant that Boston would have to carry an extra burden, providing yet another rationale for 1776 and disassociating from a dangerous Caribbean. In Philadelphia, even indentured servants of European descent were putting forward what were described as cogent and strong reasons why they should not face enlistment. Sooner rather than later, these rioters were taking up arms against the crown. Sooner than that, jurists in London could point to policy reasons as to why it might be wise to move toward abolition, to display more solicitude towards the abhorrent African so as to better confront European competitors. But indentured servants may have objected to being transported to the Caribbean to fight in a war whose strategic implications for the crown may not have been well understood by them or even seen as being in their direct interest. Easier to understand were the labor shortages that hit Pennsylvania, once these laborers found themselves in Cuba, a development which led to bringing of more Africans to this colony, which was like trying to douse a fire with gasoline. But as the War of 1756 unfolded, Governor Shirley would have none of this, feeling that survival itself was at stake, arguing that when a country is in danger of being lost to the enemy, it is not a time for the government of it to enter into critical dissertations as to whether the enlisting of indentured servants for defense could mean promoting a tendency to lessen the importation of them into the country for future tillage of the land, and to increase that of slaves, unquote. Yet, the French had not taken a vacation while their antagonists to the south of Quebec and to the east of Mobile were ensconced in ever-seen conflict, as border raids and boundary disputes continued to rage. As late as 1756, Quakers and others were seeking military exemptions, while other Europeans were forcing an exemption of sorts by deserting and mutinying. When a decision was made to take a census of enslaved Africans in Massachusetts, it was easy to infer that the authorities wanted to ascertain where potential enemies, or contrarily, potential defenders might reside. A paradox that neatly summarized a problematic dilemma. If Negro defenders were sought, this could contravene the provincial policy of racist autocracy. And it was too ghastly to digest fully the consequences of taking a consensus of potential enemies. By 1758, one slaveholder was petitioning for compensation after his Negro servant had joined the military, but was now sickly and no longer of service, nor ever likely to be, illustrating that defending the province would be costly. Yep, exactly. And that was the problem, of course, that whiteness was facing in its early days, right, Matt? Was like, there was still these religious conflicts and shit going on. I mean, 1756, you had a war, this war happening. This petition was not singular, suggesting a number of explanations, including masters, quite typically gaming the system at a time of crisis. Africans themselves were petitioning for compensation after joining in the expedition against Canada. Compensation that was being refused to them, which could make their brethren less willing to defend the crown or to attack its foes. This was no minor matter when European settlers were devising all manner of excuses to avoid military service. Here comes our friend William Gooch again. If Massachusetts had been unique, perhaps the problem of settlers' reluctance to fight could have been downplayed. But in Virginia, too, Governor William Gooch was carping about events in Albany, where there was great desertion among the troops occasioned by their want of pay. The several provinces Virginia accepted not having advanced that payment for them. Hey Damien, welcome in. By 1758, George Washington, who was particularly hostile to the idea of arming Africans, go figure, was reporting that smallpox was devastating his troops, providing an unpromising circumstance. By 1759, mutiny and mass desertion had become the hallmark of mainland soldiers. Entire regiments simply refused to perform any duty whatsoever. On the 29th of May, 1759, a Rhode Islander was shot for desertion and a fellow settler from Connecticut faced a similar destiny. On 15th of June, a train which could hardly inspire their loved ones or perhaps others to swear allegiance to the crown. Reporting in 1761 from Martinique, where the French government had just been taken prisoner, the Articles of Capitulation had been drafted. The leading redcoat invader, General Robert Mocktown, was waiting impatiently for troops from Carolina that had yet to arrive, while vessels that he expected from New York were already deemed to not be adequate, even before touching the shore. I have already been obliged to buy some provisions as a result, he lamented, and he was requesting some from England, though London might well have asked, what about the closer mainland? This had to be taken seriously, since the 1756 war was not a cakewalk for London, as a 1757 meeting between governors of North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania demonstrated. Conferring with the Earl of London, grave concern was expressed about the danger of the enemy's making an attack on the province of South Carolina, either by sea from St. Domingo or from the Alabama fort of the Creek Indians on the head of the Mobile. For which reason they have agreed that there ought to be 2,000 men employed in the defense of that valuable province of South Carolina and to secure Georgia. Unquote. The worst fears of these executives may have been realized when, in mid 1759, John Pendarvis of South Carolina, described as a free mulatto, expanded a hefty sum of 700 pounds currency for arms and ammunition, for the intended purpose of waging insurrection against the white people. Let's go! By 1760, Governor Henry Ellis of Georgia thought he had found the remedy to this problem of intrigues of the French. Quote, I've been able to sit the Chickasaws upon the Cherokees, but with little contemplation of the long-term consequences of stirring ethnic antagonism. This diabolical tactic proved unavailing in the Carolina neighbor, for by late 1761 the authorities were complaining that military contingents had been reduced so low by desertion and the like that the province had become dangerously vulnerable. Oh dear. Old habits, particularly profitable ones, die hard. However, and in the heat of the 1756 war, London's preeminent William Pitt was remonstrating Virginia governor about the intelligence he had received of an illegal and most pernicious trade carried on by the king's subjects in North America and the West Indies, as well as the French islands, not to mention the French settlements on the continent of America, and particularly to the rivers Mobile and Mississippi. This enabled and served to sustain and protect this long and expensive war, as large sums in bullion were being sent by the king's subjects to French hands. This ignominious trade was a danger. It was pronounced correctly. The only trouble was that already these Virginians were swiftly moving beyond seeing themselves as true king's subjects. Actually, a dominant theme of the 1756 war, which makes it a virtual dress rehearsal for the 1776 conflict, was the repeated accusation that settlers were double-dealing, collaborating with the French, as redcoats fought them. I've undoubted proofs, said the leading redcoat, Lord Geoffrey Amherst, in 1762, of the enemy being supplied with provisions from almost every port on the continent of North America. Though, at that precise moment, there was the greatest demand for provisions to supply the king's troops. While the redcoats were battling to seize Cuba and relieve pressure on beleaguered settlers, Lord Geoffrey knew that merchants, particularly those of Pennsylvania and New York, were entering into schemes for supplying the Havana with provisions. Pitt had also heard from Governor Shirley of Massachusetts, who too was outraged by pernicious trade carried on by the northern British colonies to the French settlement in Hispaniola. Shirley, who had traveled from South Carolina to the Bahamas by early 1760, found this to be a very large trade and very lucrative, involving about 80 or 90 vessels. Settlers had their own complaints. Affluent Carolinians could not have been pleased when European settlers were dispatched in late 1761 to Barbados, where they had a chance to witness the spectacle of great exertion in raising 500 volunteers completely armed and clothed and 500 Negroes, similarly outfitted. There were 300 Negroes in Antigua, and an exception that other islands will raise their proportions. In Barbados, Carolina's progenitor, Any master with 30 or more slaves was obliged to contribute one man to the armed force, with fines for non-compliance. Carolina settlers may have wondered understandably about the long-term viability of their prized investment in human commodities when these Africans were arming nearby. Such conscription was even more necessary in light of shortfalls among mainland settlers. Reporting from Barbados, James Douglas in 1761 was waiting anxiously for forces from America, which quite typically had yet to materialize. Yet, His Excellency and the gentlemen of this island, who had more severe security challenge, were nevertheless very zealous in having voted and raised 500 white men and 600 Negroes to sustain the Crown's forces, which Antigua and other islands will also do, Douglas added. This was crucial since he was expecting momentarily enemy privateers, while his troops were busy in the intended attack. As the pivotal year that was 1762 dawned, leading redcoats, not least due to the resistance to military service on the mainland, were raising a corps of Negro for service in Jamaica, with the aim of attacking Cuba and of marauding as far afield as New Orleans. Thousands of men were involved, though still expected was a detachment from North America of provincials. Exquisitely detailed instructions were devised to care and feeding of the latter. Special care should be taken to ensure that they be treated with all the proper attention and humanity, and that they may not return home disgusted with service, but on the contrary, will feel motivated to engage militarily on future occasions. But little attention was devoted to the problem created of having settlers serving in a similar capacity as those whom they viewed as slaves. Like an associative law of mathematics, did not that imply that these colonists were no more than despised Africans? In a summing misunderstanding of provincials, London decided that the settlers and the Africans should have an equal share in all the booty gained from the enemy in common with regular troops, and in proportion to their respective numbers, rank, and pay. Unquote. In retrospect, given such a mandate, what may be shocking is that the revolt against British rule on the mainland commenced formally in 1776, and not in 1762, or earlier when this idea was first ventilated. But did London have an alternative? Mainlanders were objecting strenuously to fighting, while the major population center of Africans, that was Jamaica, was typically afire. All this in the midst of a crucial war. In May 1762, Lord Albemarle spoke freely of the great utility of slaves to Major General Monckton's army. I believe he had near 3,000 from His Majesty's Islands, made all the more important given the great uncertainty of his receiving any enemy from Jamaica, as that island has been so much alarmed for some time past, compelling the redcoats to go on a buying spree. I purchased near 100 blacks at Martinique, with others bought at St. Kitts and Antigua. He wanted even more, and was considering raising a corps of free Negroes besides, which could only give this group leverage that could be wielded in favor of abolition. London was in a bind. Jamaica, it was said, alone could easily raise a great number of armed Africans, since there were 4 Negro towns and at least 600 who are all good marksmen, being the remains of the Negroes who were formerly in rebellion, bushfighting being their principal forte. Resorting to reliance upon Africans who had extracted more than their share of British blood was indicative of the quandary faced by London. Mainlanders were not the only whites upset by the turn that this war was taking. As the siege of Havana was exhilarating in August 1762, troops in nearby Guadeloupe focused on something else altogether. Subaltern officers were irked that they were to be deprived of rich spoils of war, slaves. It was a subject of discontent. The lords of the treasury were informed. It was unclear if mainlanders were among the grocers, but surely their outlook was reflected among these malcontents, which suggested to London the problem of their inclusion within the ranks. As the war gained momentum and the fecklessness of mainland settlers become ever more evident, Henry Ellis, who had served as governor in Georgia and knew well of the hair-pulling about slavery that had occurred there, was toting up the changing situation. With Florida taken, London could then deprive the Negro of an asylum, a Spanish policy which had ruined many of the king's subjects in America, and had left the southern frontier in a weak and unsettled condition, though the soil and climate were excellent. It was a single step from this realization to its complement, that a more forthcoming attitude towards Africans could reduce the need for asylum, transform the weak and unsettled frontier, and develop a more bountiful colonialism. Except, this would have undercut the established policy of the settlers. Gaining the Negroes to our interest, Ellis argued, by assuring them ample liberty and promising them lands on one of the neutral islands where a black colony might be settled, would be highly useful to this nation. Speaking of Britain. Though he did not consider that this prospect could terrify mainland settlers, who had been intimidated by St. Augustine for decades, and were to be hounded by Haiti for decades to come. As for settlers, he saw them as an attacking force against Havana, cannon fodder in a sense, since they were entirely free from danger, an opinion not widely shared on the mainland. A 1756 law in troublesome Antigua illustrated the challenge to which Ellis responded. The small number of our able men and the neatness of our populace of the French islands make it absolutely necessary that our whole force should be constantly preserved in good posture. And this could be accomplished by dint of many free Negroes, theretofore not incorporated into any of the regiments of this island. Yes, several fatal accidents had ensured previously from entrusting arms and ammunition with the Negroes, but the present crisis did not admit many alternatives. With the need to curb restlessness among the unabashedly gladiatorial Africans of Antigua by building a buffer of free Negroes, and the continuing security threat posed by European competitors, London was moving in a direction on this island that would have found favor with Ellis. The 1756 war seemed to conclude with a smashing victory for London, though popularity, much of the subsequent analysis has focused on the ouster of France from Quebec. In terms of the slavery that provided propulsion to the mainland, the ouster of Spain from Florida, and from Cuba for a while, was decidedly more profound. The rear base and material aid for fleeing Africans was decimated, opening the door to increased importation of Africans to Georgia and Carolina particularly. The apparent eradication of the threat from both Spain and France to the mainland set the stage for the North American colonies to follow up aggressively on their wartime and intimate dealings with London's European antagonists, and forged what amounted to a de facto alliance against Britain, as was reflected in 1776. This occurring as London was a few years away from judicial ruling that seemed to suggest that abolition was arriving within the empire, and if Henry Ellis is to be believed, a reordering of the role of Africans in certain colonies was also in store, which would place them at odds with mainland provinces. Colonists paying attention may have noticed that beginning in 1760s, there were a string of cases in English courts concerning slavery in England. France's ability to appeal to indigenes had provided sustenance for this war, and in the aftermath, London chose to try to hinder settlers from moving further west, seizing their land and compelling Africans to work it. These measures infuriated land speculators, notably in Virginia, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Arthur Lee, and Patrick Henry. Real old rogues gallery right there. That is a murderer's row of rebels. Thank you, Horne. That's even better than what I said, actually. Thank you. A murderer's row of rebels. Yes, thank you. I like that better. That was even better than what I just said. Choctaws and other indigenes were undermined, akin to Africans, when European powers were ousted. This was good news for settlers, who could now take the land of the indigenes and deepen enslavement of the Africans. The Virginia elite was also taken aback by the cooperation between Africans and indigenes during the war. What caused general consternation, according to a correspondent of the lieutenant governor, was indigenes saving and caressing all the Negroes, which seemed to be a prelude to an insurrection with the most serious consequences. It was also noted with concern that the enslaved were convinced, as one Euro-Virginian admitted, that the French were willing to give them their freedom, and the concomitant threat of slave uprisings shaped indelibly the colony's wartime mobilization. The 1756 war, in short, lit a fuse that then exploded in a revolt against the crown in 1776. Likewise, and not unrelated, was the changed circumstance for captive Africans, who continued arriving by the boatload on the mainland, but now found weakened rear bases in Quebec and St. Augustine, previously used to launch punishing attacks against British settlements. And there you have it. That is Chapter 7, The Biggest Losers, Africans, and the 7 Years' War. Next Tuesday, we'll be reading Chapter 8, From Havana to Newport.